The afternoon at Baker Street unfolded with the unhurried patience of a day that expected nothing in particular. London, beyond the windows of our sitting room at 221B, had settled into that gentle lull which sometimes arrives between the busyness of midday and the gradual stirrings of evening. The street outside was neither silent nor lively. Instead, it seemed to move at a thoughtful pace, as though the city itself had paused to collect its breath. The fog had not yet arrived, though the sky possessed that pale softness which often preceded it. Sunlight filtered through the thin clouds and rested quietly upon the brick buildings opposite, giving them a muted glow. Inside, the sitting room remained comfortably warm. Hudson had tended the fire earlier in the day, and the coals now burned with a steady warmth that required no further attention. The familiar scent of polished wood and tea leaves lingered in the air, blending with the faint trace of coal smoke drifting from nearby chimneys. Sherlock Holmes sat in his usual armchair beside the hearth. His long frame appeared perfectly at ease, though experience had taught me that Holmes was rarely idle in the true sense of the word. His eyes were half closed, his fingers loosely steepled together, and his expression carried that quiet stillness which often signaled the quiet movement of thought. Upon the table beside him rested his violin. It lay exactly where he had placed it earlier that morning, the bow resting lightly across its strings. Holmes had not touched the instrument since breakfast, though I suspected he was aware of its presence all the same. For my own part, I occupied the chair opposite him with a medical journal that I had already read twice. It is curious how often reading becomes less about the discovery of new knowledge and more about the simple comfort of turning familiar pages. The rhythm of it can be reassuring, particularly on an afternoon that asks for nothing more than quiet companionship. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Outside, a carriage passed slowly along Baker Street. Its wheels produced a soft, measured sound upon the road before fading into the distance. Holmes opened his eyes. "There are hours in London," he said, "when the city remembers how to be patient." I lowered my journal. "And this is one of them?" I asked. Holmes inclined his head slightly. "Yes," he replied. "Afternoon possesses a different temperament from morning. Morning expects productivity, evening invites reflection. But afternoon—" he paused briefly. "Afternoon is content merely to exist." I mouthed faintly. "You make it sound almost philosophical." Holmes' gaze drifted toward the window. "Observation often becomes philosophy," he said, "when one has time enough to consider it." The fire shifted quietly in the grate. "You have not played today," I observed, glancing toward the violin. "No," Holmes replied. "And yet you keep it close." Holmes's lips curved slightly. "Music," he said, "has a curious relationship with silence. Each depends upon the other for meaning." I considered this for a moment. "And today favors silence?" I asked. "For now," Holmes replied. The clock upon the mantel continued its steady marking of time. Its quiet ticking blended so naturally with the room that one noticed it only after deliberately listening. Like many objects at Baker Street, it had become a part of the atmosphere rather than an interruption to it. Holmes leaned forward slightly and adjusted the position of a log in the fire. "There are mysteries," he said, "that arrive with considerable noise." I raised an eyebrow. "You refer to our more memorable cases." "Indeed," Holmes replied. "Sudden knocks at the door, breathless clients, stolen jewels, missing persons, elaborate conspiracies." "And yet," I said, "you do not sound particularly enthusiastic about them at the moment." Holmes settled back into his chair. "Because they are rarely the most interesting." I set my journal aside. "What, then, would you consider the most interesting?" Holmes gestured lightly toward the room. The quieter ones, he said. Quieter? I echoed. Yes, Holmes replied. Sort that appear so ordinary that no one recognizes them as mysteries at all. The notion intrigued me. And how does one recognize such mysteries? I asked. Holmes smiled faintly. By noticing when something small has changed. Outside, the sky had grown slightly dimmer. A thin veil of cloud now softened the sunlight, casting Baker Street in a gentle gray. I rose and crossed to the window, drawing the curtain aside just enough to glance down at the street. A gentleman walked past, carrying parcel beneath his arm. A woman paused briefly to adjust her hat before continuing on her way. Nothing appeared unusual. Everything looks perfectly ordinary, I said. Holmes chuckled softly. Precisely. I returned to my chair. You believe something will happen this afternoon? Holmes considered the question. Not necessarily, he said, but I have learned that calm days often invite the most curious visitors. The clock marked another quarter hour. Holmes's gaze drifted once more toward the violin, though he made no movement to reach for it. Instead, he spoke again. There are people, he said, who live their lives with great care. They develop habits so precise that even the smallest disruption becomes noticeable. Yes, I said, I have known patients like that. Holmes nodded. Houses often reflect their occupants, he continued. Chairs placed in exactly the same position, books arranged with deliberate order, lamps trimmed at a particular hour each evening. And if something disturbs that order? I asked. Holmes folded his hands together. Then the disturbance becomes a mystery. The fire crackled softly. Holmes closed his eyes once more, as though listening to something beyond the room. It is curious, he said quietly, how often the simplest routines conceal the most interesting questions. Just then footsteps sounded upon the stairs. They were not hurried footsteps, nor particularly heavy ones. Rather, they carried the careful rhythm of someone who approached with hesitation. Holmes opened his eyes. Mrs. Hudson appeared a moment later in the doorway, her expression calm as always. There is a gentleman downstairs, Mr. Holmes, she said. He asks if he might speak with you. Holmes rose slowly. Did he say what he wished to discuss? He asked. Mrs. Hudson shook her head gently. No, sir, she said. Only that it concerns something rather unusual about his home. Holmes's faint smile returned. Then we should certainly hear him. Mrs. Hudson nodded and descended the stairs once more. Holmes turned toward me. You see, Watson, he said. Yes? The afternoon has decided not to remain ordinary after all. Moments later, we heard the quiet sound of a visitor approaching the door. And though neither Holmes nor I yet knew it, the gentleman about to enter Baker Street had come to speak of a house where something curious happened each night, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a patience that had begun at last to attract attention. The gentleman who entered our sitting room did so with a careful kind of quiet. He paused just inside the doorway, holding his hat with both hands, as though uncertain whether he had arrived too early or perhaps a little too late. His coat was well kept, though not new, and his manner suggested a man accustomed to order rather than display. Holmes greeted him with the calm courtesy that always seemed to ease the nerves of visitors. Please come in, he said gently. You are most welcome. The man stepped forward and inclined his head. Thank you, Mr. Holmes. His voice was soft, though steady. There was no trace of alarm in it, only a thoughtful unease. Holmes gestured toward the chair nearest the fire. Pray sit down, he said. The gentleman accepted the invitation and lowered himself carefully into the chair, placing his hat neatly upon his knees, rather than setting it aside. Holmes observed him quietly for a moment. It was a habit of his to allow silence to settle before asking questions. Many visitors found themselves speaking sooner than they intended, simply because the room itself seemed to encourage honesty. "I understand," Holmes said at last, "that you have come to discuss something unusual about your home." The gentleman nodded. "Yes, Mr. Holmes." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "May I ask your name?" "Edward Finch," the man replied. "I reside in Bloomsbury, not far from Russell Square." Holmes folded his hands together. "Bloomsbury is a most agreeable district," he said. "Quiet streets, orderly houses." "Yes," Mr. Finch said with a faint smile. "That is precisely why I chose it." I watched him with interest. He was perhaps in his early 40s, with neatly combed hair and a thoughtful expression. His manner suggested someone accustomed to routine, someone who preferred predictability over excitement. "And your house?" Holmes asked gently. "It is a narrow terrace," Mr. Finch replied. "2 floors, with a small garden behind." Holmes's eyes brightened slightly. "Garden?" he said. "Yes." Finch replied. There was a brief pause. "It is the garden," he added quietly, "that brings me here." Holmes leaned back comfortably in his chair. "Please," he said, "tell us about it." Finch hesitated for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "You see," he said, "I have lived in the house for several years. During that time I have kept the garden myself." "A pleasant occupation," Holmes observed. "Yes," Mr. Finch agreed, "very much so." His gaze drifted toward fire as he continued. "Attend the paths, trim the hedges, water the flowers. Nothing elaborate, just enough to keep things orderly." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "Routine again," he said. "Yes," Mr. Finch replied. He took a slow breath. "For the past 3 weeks, however, I have noticed something rather curious." Holmes said nothing, allowing the man to continue. "Each morning," Mr. Finch said, "when I step into the garden, I find that something has already been done." "Done?" Holmes repeated. "Yes." Mr. Finch's voice remained calm, though there was unmistakable confusion behind it. "The gravel path will have been swept," he said. "Leaves gathered neatly beside the wall. A rose branch trimmed that I distinctly remember leaving untouched." I felt my curiosity stir. "And you did not do these things yourself?" I asked. Mr. Finch shook his head. "No," he said. Holmes leaned forward slightly. "Do you employ a gardener?" "No." "Have you given anyone a key to the garden gate?" "No." Holmes rested his fingertips together. "And the gate?" "Locked," Mr. Finch said immediately. "Each evening?" Holmes nodded slowly. "You are certain of this?" "Quite certain." The fire crackled softly. Holmes appeared neither surprised nor alarmed. Instead, he regarded our visitor with quiet interest. "And when did you first notice these changes?" he asked. Mr. Finch thought for a moment. 3 weeks ago," he said. "Perhaps 4. "And they occur every morning?" "Not every morning," Mr. Finch replied, "but often enough that I have begun to expect them." Holmes smiled faintly. "Expectation is an interesting thing," he said. Finch looked puzzled. "How so?" "When we begin to expect something," Holmes explained, "we notice it more clearly." Mr. Finch nodded. "Yes, that is quite true." He paused before adding quietly, "The curious thing is that the changes are never disruptive." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "In what way?" "They are helpful," Mr. Finch said. He gave a small, almost apologetic smile. "The garden always looks better." Holmes chuckled softly. "That is unusual." "Yes," Mr. Finch agreed. He leaned forward slightly. "That is why I hesitated to come here." "You did not feel threatened," Holmes said. "No," Mr. Finch replied. "Then why seek my assistance?" Mr. Finch's expression grew thoughtful. "Because," he said slowly, "I cannot understand how it happens." Holmes nodded. Understanding, he said, is often more compelling than fear. The room grew quiet again. Outside, a faint breeze brushed against the windows of Baker Street. Holmes stood and walked slowly to the fireplace, resting one hand upon the mantel. "Tell me," he said gently, "what time do you usually retire for the night?" Mr. Finch blinked in mild surprise. "Shortly after 11, he said. "And when you wake?" 6, most mornings." Holmes nodded. "A man of admirable consistency." Mr. Finch smiled faintly. "I suppose I am." Holmes turned slightly. "And during the night?" he asked. "Have you ever heard movement in the garden?" Mr. Finch shook his head. "No." "Not even the sound of footsteps?" "No." Holmes returned to his chair. "Most curious," he murmured. I glanced between the two men. "You have inspected the gate and walls, I assume?" I asked. "Every morning," Mr. Finch replied. "There is no sign that anyone has entered." Holmes rested comfortably in his chair once more. "And yet the garden proves itself." "Yes," Mr. Finch said. Holmes smiled. "That is perhaps the most agreeable mystery I have encountered in some time." Mr. Finch laughed softly. "Yes, I suppose it is." Holmes regarded him thoughtfully. "There is only one sensible course of action," he said, "and that is—" Holmes reached for his coat. "To see the garden for ourselves." Finch looked relieved. "You would visit?" Holmes nodded. "If you are agreeable." "I would welcome it," Mr. Finch said at once. Holmes glanced toward the window, where the afternoon light had begun to soften into the early hints of evening. "Bloomsbury is not far," he said. He turned to me. "Watson, I believe a short walk would do us good." I stood and reached for my coat. "Very good." Mr. Finch rose as well, his expression noticeably lighter than when he had arrived. Holmes opened the door. "Lead the way, Mr. Finch," he said. And so, with the quiet ease of an afternoon that had decided to become something slightly more interesting, we prepared to leave Baker Street. Somewhere in Bloomsbury, a small garden waited. And though its mystery was gentle rather than alarming, it had clearly been patient enough to attract Sherlock Holmes's attention. We left Baker Street without haste. Holmes never hurried when there was no need. And on this particular afternoon, there seemed very little reason for urgency. The sky above London had softened into a pale gray, the sort of quiet color that often accompanies the gradual approach of evening. Mr. Finch walked beside us with measured steps, his hat now resting comfortably upon his head. The earlier hesitation that had marked his arrival at Baker Street had faded somewhat. He seemed relieved, perhaps simply by having spoken aloud the curious matter that had occupied his thoughts. London received us with its usual mixture of sound and calm. Carriages passed occasionally along the larger streets, their wheels producing a gentle rhythm upon the pavement. Shopkeepers stood in doorways, speaking quietly with one another, while pedestrians moved about their business with the steady pace of city accustomed to continuity. Holmes walked with his hands clasped loosely behind his back. "You mentioned," he said after a few moments, "that you have lived in Bloomsbury several years." "Yes," Mr. Finch replied. "Nearly 6, I believe." Holmes inclined his head. "And the garden has always been your own responsibility?" "Entirely." "You have never employed assistants?" "No." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "Gardens," he said, "are among the most revealing reflections of their caretakers." Mr. Finch smiled faintly. "In what way?" Holmes gestured lightly toward a small patch of greenery we passed beside the pavement. "A garden rarely grows according to chance," he explained. "Even when it appears wild, some form of intention lies beneath the surface." I glanced toward the plants Holmes had indicated. Though small and unassuming, They had indeed been arranged with quiet care. "You believe Mr. Finch's garden reflects his habits?" I asked. Holmes smiled. "I suspect it does." Mr. Finch appeared mildly amused. "I fear my habits may be rather ordinary ones." Holmes shook his head. "Ordinary habits," he said, "are often the most consistent." He continued walking for several minutes. The fervor. The streets gradually grew quieter as we moved farther from Baker Street. The air carried the faint scent of damp stone and distant coal fires, while the light of the afternoon began slowly to fade. It was one of those London hours when the city seemed content to exist without spectacle. Holmes spoke again. "Tell me," he said, "do you ever wake during the night?" Finch considered the question. "Occasionally," he said, "though rarely for long." "And when you do wake," Holmes continued, "do you leave your bed?" Mr. Finch shook his head. "No, I usually return to sleep almost immediately." Holmes nodded slowly. "Interesting." Mr. Finch glanced at him. "Do you believe the answer lies in the house itself?" Holmes's faint smile returned. "Houses often participate in the routines of their occupants," he said. "In what sense?" Holmes gestured lightly toward the street around us. "Consider a staircase used every day for many years," he said. "Each step learns the rhythm of its owner's foot." I chuckled softly. "You make the house sound almost alive." Holmes's expression remained thoughtful. "Not alive, perhaps," he said, "but attentive." Mr. Finch seemed intrigued by the idea. "I have always felt comfortable in my home," he said. "It has never seemed unusual." "And yet, recently," Holmes said, "it has begun to surprise you." "Yes." Holmes nodded. "Surprise," he said, "is often the result of noticing something that has existed for some time." We turned down a quieter street, where the buildings stood closer together. Tall brick houses lined both sides of the road, their windows reflecting the dimming sky. Mr. Finch slowed slightly. "We are nearly there," he said. Holmes glanced about with interest. Bloomsbury possessed a calm dignity that differed subtly from the lovelier streets nearer Baker Street. The houses appeared orderly and restrained, as though they had long ago agreed upon a quiet understanding with one another. "Your street?" Holmes asked. "Just ahead." As we approached, the atmosphere seemed even quieter than before. A single lamppost stood near the corner, not yet lit, though the fading daylight suggested that it soon would be. Finch stopped before a narrow terrace house midway along the row. "This is the one." Holmes regarded it with quiet attention. The house itself appeared entirely ordinary. Its brick facade showed the mild weathering of age, though the windows were clean, and the small iron railing before the entrance had been carefully maintained. "There is nothing unusual about it," I observed. Holmes nodded. "Which makes it all the more interesting." Mr. Finch produced a key and opened the front door. The lock turned smoothly. Inside, the air felt still and cool. He stepped aside politely. "Please," he said, "come in." Holmes entered first, pausing just inside the narrow hallway. The interior reflected the same careful order we had already begun to associate with Mr. Finch. A small table stood near the wall, upon which rested a neatly folded umbrella. The coat rack beside it held only a single coat, brushed and properly hung. "Very orderly," Holmes said quietly. Mr. Finch smiled. "I find it easier to think in an orderly place." Holmes nodded approvingly. "That is a sensible philosophy." Mr. Finch led us through the house toward the rear door. "The garden is just beyond here." He opened the door gently. Evening air drifted in, cool and calm. Holmes stepped outside. The garden was modest in size, but unmistakably well cared for. A gravel path ran neatly between two rows of flowers, leading toward a small wooden bench near the back wall. Rose bushes climbed carefully arranged trellises, while a narrow border of lavender lined one side of the path. Holmes stood still for several moments. "You see?" Mr. Finch said softly. Holmes crouched slightly, examining the gravel path. It had clearly been swept recently. The surface lay smooth and undisturbed, save for the faint impressions of the three of us standing there now. "And you did not sweep this today?" Holmes asked. "No." Holmes nodded slowly. He rose and looked around the garden with thoughtful interest. "The work is careful," he said. "Yes." "Not hurried." "No." Holmes brushed a small leaf from the path. "And you found it like this morning?" "Yes." Holmes's faint smile returned. "Well," he said calmly, "this is certainly a most considerate mystery." Finch looked at him expectantly. Holmes glanced toward the quiet garden gate at the far wall. "Tell me," he said gently, "when did you last lock that gate?" Mr. Finch followed his gaze. "Last night." Holmes stepped slowly along the gravel path. "That," he said quietly, "is precisely what we shall discover." The garden grew quieter as evening settled around it. The light above Bloomsbury had softened into that gentle blue-gray which arrives just before the lamps of London begin to glow. Shadows lengthened along the narrow path, though nothing in the small garden appeared troubled by the coming of night. Sherlock Holmes stood still for several moments. He had the peculiar ability to become almost motionless when observing something carefully. One might easily mistake such stillness for idleness, but I had learned that it often indicated the exact opposite. Mr. Finch waited patiently beside the doorway. "I assure you," he said after a moment, "I have searched the garden thoroughly each morning." Holmes nodded without looking away from the gravel path. "I do not doubt it," he replied calmly. He bent slightly and examined the neat surface of the path. "You swept this yesterday evening?" "Yes." "And this morning you found it already prepared again?" "Exactly so." Holmes brushed the gravel lightly with the tip of his shoe. "It has been swept carefully," he murmured. Mr. Finch nodded. "That is what puzzled me." Holmes straightened and turned his attention to the rose bushes. Their branches had been trimmed with quiet precision. Nothing appeared hurried or careless. Each cut had been made thoughtfully, leaving the plants healthier than before. "You tend these roses yourself?" Holmes asked. "Yes, and yet someone trimmed them further." "Just so." Holmes studied the branches for several seconds. "The work is not clumsy," he said. "No," Mr. Finch agreed. "Quite the opposite." Holmes smiled faintly. "That is what makes the matter interesting." I walked slowly along the path, noticing how orderly everything appeared. The garden possessed a peaceful quality that made the mystery feel strangely comforting rather than troubling. Nothing had been damaged, nothing disturbed. If anything, the place appeared more cared for than before. Holmes continued his quiet inspection. He examined the wooden bench near the back wall, brushing away a single fallen leaf. "You sit here often?" he asked. "In the evenings," Mr. Finch replied. Holmes nodded thoughtfully. A pleasant place to reflect. The small garden wall rose just beyond the bench, separating the space from neighboring houses. Ivy climbed partway along the bricks, while the wooden gate stood firmly closed. Holmes approached it. "May I?" "Of course." Mr. Finch produced another key and unlocked the gate. Holmes pushed it open slowly. Beyond it lay a narrow alleyway that ran behind the terrace houses. It appeared empty and undisturbed. Holmes stepped briefly into the alley and looked left and right. No one passed. The evening air had grown noticeably cooler now, carrying the faint scent of damp stone and distant cooking fires. Holmes closed the gate again. "And you lock this each evening?" he asked. "Without fail." Holmes nodded approvingly. Consistency is a valuable habit. Mr. Finch looked thoughtful. I have always believed so. Holmes walked slowly back toward the house, his eyes moving calmly from one part of the garden to another. At last he stopped near the center of the path. You say these changes began 3 weeks ago? Yes, and nothing else in the house has been disturbed. No. Holmes folded his hands behind his back. Most curious. Mr. Finch shifted slightly. You do not believe someone is entering the garden? Holmes shook his head gently. If they were, he said, we would see signs of haste. Haste? Yes, Holmes replied. An intruder rarely tidies. Mr. Finch chuckled softly. That is true. Holmes glanced toward the house windows. Tell me, he said, which room is yours? The one above the garden. Holmes nodded. You sleep lightly? I suppose so. And yet you've never heard movement here at night? Never. Holmes spoke quietly for a moment longer. Then he spoke with the same calm tone he often used when explaining something simple. Mr. Finch, he said, may I ask another question? Of course. Holmes gestured toward the neatly swept path. When you woke this morning and saw the garden prepared like this, what was your first thought? Mr. Finch considered carefully. I suppose that someone had been here. And your second thought? That made no sense. Holmes smiled slightly. Quite understandable. The sky had darkened further now, and the first street lamp flickered to life somewhere beyond the garden wall. A warm glow appeared faintly above the rooftops. Holmes turned toward the house. I think, he said, we should continue this conversation inside. Mr. Finch looked relieved. Yes, of course. We stepped back into the house, leaving the quiet garden behind us. The sitting room was small, but comfortable. A modest fire burned in the grate, giving the room a gentle warmth. Holmes removed his gloves and sat in the nearest chair. Mr. Finch settled opposite him. I took a seat beside the window. For a moment, no one spoke. Holmes's eyes moved slowly around the room. Books rested neatly on a small shelf. A writing desk stood near the wall, its papers arranged in careful order. Everything reflected the same thoughtful habits we had already begun to observe. Finch, Holmes said at last, you are a man who appreciates routine. Yes, Mr. Finch replied. Holmes nodded. And routine, he continued, has a curious tendency to continue, even when one does not expect it. Mr. Finch looked puzzled. I am not sure I follow. Holmes leaned back comfortably in his chair. Sometimes, he said calmly, a pattern becomes so familiar that it continues without conscious effort. Mr. Finch blinked. You mean? Holmes smiled faintly. Let us not reach conclusions too quickly, he said. Outside, evening had fully arrived. The quiet Bloomsbury street lay calm beneath the glow of newly lit lamps. Inside the house, the fire crackled softly. Holmes rested his hands together and looked thoughtfully toward the garden door. There's something very peaceful about your garden, he said. Mr. Finch nodded. I've always felt so. Holmes's eyes brightened slightly. And peaceful places, he added quietly, often encourage familiar habits. Mr. Finch leaned forward slightly. You believe the explanation is something simple? Holmes's smile returned. Simple things, he said, are often the most satisfying to understand. The room grew quiet again, and though the mystery of the garden had not yet been explained, it no longer felt quite so puzzling. Instead, it felt patient, as though the answer had been there all along, waiting calmly to be noticed. The small sitting room in Mr. Finch's house possessed the same quiet order as the garden outside. The fire in the grate burned gently, its glow resting comfortably against the polished wood of the furniture. Nothing in the room appeared hurried or neglected. Every object seemed to occupy its place with quiet confidence. Sherlock Holmes observed the room without speaking for several moments. His eyes moved slowly from the bookshelf to the writing desk, and then to the small mantel above the fireplace, where a modest clock stood ticking softly. Mr. Finch watched him with polite patience. "I hope the room is not too ordinary," he said at last. Holmes turned toward him with a faint smile. "On the contrary," he replied, "ordinary rooms often tell the most interesting stories." Finch seemed amused by this. "I am afraid I lead a rather uneventful life." Holmes settled comfortably into his chair. "Uneventful lives," he said, "often contain the most dependable routines." Finch nodded. "Yes, I suppose that is true." Holmes rested his fingertips together, a familiar gesture that suggested quiet thought. "Tell me," he said gently, "how does your day usually begin?" Mr. Finch considered the question. "Well, I wake around 6, Holmes nodded. "And then I prepare tea," Mr. Finch said. "After that I usually step into the garden for a few minutes before beginning my work." "And what work is that?" Holmes, "I catalog archival documents for a legal office near Russell Square." Holmes inclined his head. "A profession that values precision." "Very much so," Mr. Finch replied. Holmes smiled faintly. "That explains much." Mr. Finch raised an eyebrow. "In what way?" Holmes gestured lightly toward the orderly desk. "People who spend their days organizing information often maintain the same habits at home." Mr. Finch looked around the room and laughed softly. "You may be right." Holmes continued calmly. "And the garden?" he asked. Mr. Finch leaned back slightly. "The garden is my evening ritual." Holmes listened attentively. "After supper," Mr. Finch continued, "I step outside for a short time. I sweep the path if needed, trim anything that requires attention, and water the plants." Holmes nodded approvingly. "A sensible routine." "Yes," Finch said. "I find it rather calming." Holmes's eyes drifted briefly toward the garden door. "And you followed this routine for many years?" "Nearly 6. Holmes leaned forward slightly. "Every evening?" "Almost every evening." Holmes sat back again, satisfied. "Consistency," he said quietly, "is a powerful thing." The clock on the mantel ticked softly. I had begun to notice that the entire house seemed to move according to a quiet rhythm. Nothing was abrupt, nothing out of place. Holmes spoke again after a short pause. "When you step into the garden each morning," he said, "what is the first thing you notice?" Mr. Finch thought for a moment. "The path," he said. Holmes nodded. "And when it has already been swept?" "I stop and look around," Mr. Finch replied, "to see if anything else has been done." Holmes smiled faintly. "And has it?" "Yes." "What sort of things?" Mr. Finch gestured slightly as he spoke. "A trimmed branch, leaves gathered near the wall. Once, the watering can had been placed beside the roses." Holmes's eyes brightened slightly. "You had not left it there?" "No." Holmes folded his hands again. "Very interesting." Mr. Finch leaned forward with growing curiosity. "You believe these changes are not random?" "No," Holmes replied calmly. "They are deliberate." Finch nodded. "That is what puzzled me." Holmes glanced toward the garden door again. "The work is careful," he said, "and consistent with your own habits." Mr. Finch seemed surprised. "You think whoever does this understands the garden?" "Perfectly," Holmes replied. The fire crackled softly. For a moment, the room grew quiet again, and Holmes asked another question. "Finch," he said, "do you ever dream fur?" Mr. Finch blinked in mild surprise. "Dream?" "Yes." Mr. Finch considered. "Occasionally," he said, "though nothing remarkable." Holmes nodded. "And in these dreams," he continued, "do you find yourself tending the plants?" Mr. Finch smiled faintly. "Yes, I suppose I do." Holmes appeared satisfied. "See, Watson," he said, turning toward me briefly. Habit does not rest simply because the mind does. Mr. Finch looked intrigued. I am afraid I do not entirely follow. Holmes leaned forward slightly. The human mind, he said gently, is remarkably loyal to routine. Mr. Finch listened carefully. When we repeat a task often enough, Holmes continued, the body remembers it, even when we are not consciously thinking about it. Mr. Finch's expression grew thoughtful. You mean, like muscle memory? Exactly. Holmes gestured toward the garden. Your evening routine has been practiced hundreds of times. Mr. Finch nodded slowly. Yes. Holmes's voice remained calm and reassuring, and routines practiced so often sometimes continue even when the mind is elsewhere. Mr. Finch sat very still. Are you suggesting? Holmes smiled kindly. I am suggesting only that habits are remarkably persistent. The clock ticked steadily. Outside, a soft breeze brushed against the garden gate. Mr. Finch leaned back slowly. You believe the explanation lies with me? Holmes shook his head gently. Not with you alone, he said. Mr. Finch looked puzzled. With your routine. The fire flickered quietly. Holmes glanced once more toward the garden door. There are moments between sleeping and waking, he said calmly, when the body continues familiar patterns. Mr. Finch's eyes widened slightly. You think I might? Holmes raised a hand gently. There is nothing alarming about it, he said. Many people walk, move, or perform simple tasks during those hours without remembering them. Finch sat in thoughtful silence. The idea seemed to settle gradually. I have always slept rather deeply, he said. Holmes nodded. And your garden routine has been practiced faithfully. Finch smiled faintly. So you believe the garden is not being visited by a stranger? Holmes returned the smile. No stranger, he said. Mr. Finch looked toward the garden door. Only habit. Holmes nodded gently. Yes. The room grew quiet again, and now a small Bloomsbury house felt even calmer than before. The mystery of the garden no longer seemed puzzling. Instead, it felt familiar, as though the quiet routines of the house had simply continued doing what they had always done, patiently, carefully, and without needing to be noticed. For several moments after Holmes had spoken, the small sitting room remained perfectly still. Mr. Finch sat quietly in his chair, his gaze resting somewhere near the fire, as though the gentle flames might help him sort the thoughts now moving through his mind. Sherlock Holmes, for his part, did not rush to fill the silence. He had always believed that an idea, once introduced, required a little space to settle comfortably. At last, Mr. Finch spoke. You truly believe, he said slowly, that I might be tending the garden myself without remembering it? Holmes's expression remained calm and reassuring. It is certainly a possibility, he replied. Mr. Finch considered this carefully. I have never walked in my sleep before. Holmes inclined his head slightly. Many people do so without ever realizing it. Mr. Finch gave a thoughtful nod. That seems rather remarkable. Holmes rested his hands loosely upon the arms of his chair. The mind, he said, possesses several states between waking and sleep. Mr. Finch listened attentively. Most people are familiar with only two of them, Holmes continued, fully awake and fully asleep. Yes, Mr. Finch said, but there exists a middle ground, Holmes said. A quiet state in which the body continues certain familiar activities, while the conscious mind remains at rest. Mr. Finch glanced toward the garden door. And habits continue there? Holmes smiled faintly. Habits are particularly comfortable there. The fire crackled softly, sending a small ripple of warmth through the room. Holmes continued in the same steady tone. When a task is repeated often enough, the body remembers how to perform it, even when the mind is not directing it. Mr. Finch leaned forward slightly. So the sweeping of the path, The trimming of branches, Holmes nodded, may simply be the continuation of a routine practiced many times. Mr. Finch sat back slowly. That would explain why the work is done exactly as I would have done it. Precisely. Mr. Finch gave a quiet laugh. I suppose it is the most considerate mystery imaginable. Holmes's eyes twinkled slightly. Yes, he said. One rarely encounters a case in which the only crime is excessive tidiness. I could not help smiling. The room had grown noticeably more relaxed since Holmes first introduced his explanation. Mr. Finch no longer appeared troubled. Instead, he seemed quietly fascinated by the possibility. "Tell me," Holmes said gently, "have you ever awakened in the morning feeling unusually rested after tending the garden the evening before?" Mr. Finch thought for a moment. "Yes," he said slowly. "Now that you mention it," Holmes nodded. "That is quite common." Mr. Finch raised an eyebrow. "In what way?" Holmes leaned back slightly. "Repetition of familiar actions can be remarkably soothing to the mind." Mr. Finch smiled faintly. "So even sleepwalking might be restful?" Holmes chuckled softly. "In certain circumstances, yes." The clock on the mantel continued its quiet ticking. Holmes glanced toward it thoughtfully. "There is a reason," he said, "that evening routines are so important." Mr. Finch looked curious. "Routines help signal to the mind that the day's ending," Holmes explained. "Preparing tea, reading a book, tending a garden." Mr. Finch nodded. "I see." Holmes gestured lightly toward the fire. "These small rituals create a rhythm," he said, "and when that rhythm becomes familiar enough, the body continues it naturally." Mr. Finch leaned back comfortably now. "It is rather comforting to think of it that way." Holmes smiled. "Indeed." The fire settled into a steady glow. Outside, the quiet Bloomsbury street remained calm beneath the soft light of evening lamps. Mr. Finch glanced again toward the garden door. "I wonder," he said, "if the garden will look different tomorrow." Holmes shook his head gently. "I suspect it will look very much the same." Mr. Finch smiled. "That would be reassuring." Holmes rose slowly from his chair. "I would suggest only one small change." Mr. Finch looked up. "And what would that be?" Holmes walked calmly toward the garden door and rested his hand lightly upon the handle. "Tomorrow evening," he said, "perform your routine exactly as you always have." Mr. Finch nodded. "And then?" Holmes turned back toward him. "And then," he said, "simply observe what happens next." Mr. Finch chuckled softly. "You make it sound like a scientific experiment." Holmes smiled. "In a sense, it is." The quiet room seemed to agree with him. Mr. Finch stood as well. "I must say, Mr. Holmes, I already feel much more at ease." Holmes inclined his head. "That was always the intention." Finch glanced around his sitting room. "The house already feels different somehow." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "Understanding has that effect." Mr. Finch reached for his hat. "I cannot thank you enough for your time." Holmes waved a hand lightly. "It has been a most agreeable visit." Mr. Finch walked with us toward the door. "I will follow your suggestion this evening," he said. Holmes smiled. "I believe you will find it enlightening." A few moments later we stepped back into the quiet Bloomsbury street. The air had grown cooler, and the lamps now cast long golden reflections along the pavement. Holmes began walking slowly back toward the main road. "Well, Watson," he said. I glanced at him. "A most peaceful mystery," I replied. Holmes nodded. "Yes." He clasped his hands behind his back once more as we walked. "There are many mysteries in the world," he said, "some loud, some dangerous, and some," I added, "quiet." Holmes smiled faintly. "Yes." He glanced briefly toward the darkening sky above London. "And quiet mysteries," he said, "are often the most satisfying to understand." Our footsteps echoed softly along the calm evening street as we made our way back toward Baker Street. Behind us, Mr. Finch's small house stood quietly in Bloomsbury, and beyond its door, the little garden waited patiently for night to fall, just as it always had. Holmes and I walked for some distance before either of us spoke again. The streets of Bloomsbury had settled into their evening quiet. Lamps glowed softly above the pavement, their light forming warm circles upon the stone, while the rest of the street faded into a comfortable darkness. London possessed many moods, but this was one of my favorites. The busy energy of the day had passed, and the deeper stillness of night had not yet fully arrived. People moved more slowly at this hour, as though the city itself had decided that there was no need to hurry. Holmes walked with his usual unhurried stride, his hands clasped lightly behind his back. "Well, Watson," he said at last, "what do you make of our garden mystery?" I considered the question. "It is certainly the most peaceful case we've encountered for." Holmes smiled faintly. "Yes," he agreed, "and perhaps the most instructive." "In what way?" Holmes glanced briefly toward one of the quiet terraces we were passing. "People often assume that mysteries require something dramatic," he said. "A theft, perhaps, or a crime." "Yes," Holmes nodded, "but many mysteries are simply misunderstandings of ordinary things." We walked a few more steps in silence. "Mr. Finch," I said, "struck me as a man who appreciates order." "Very much so," Holmes replied, "and his garden reflects that." Holmes inclined his head. "Indeed." He paused briefly near a lamppost, studying the quiet street around us. "You noticed how carefully the roses were trimmed?" "Yes, and the path swept with deliberate care." "Exactly." Holmes resumed walking. "The interesting part," he continued, "is not that the garden was tended, but that Mr. Finch did not remember doing it," I said. Holmes smiled. "Precisely." The soft sound of a carriage drifted from a distant street before fading again. "Habits," Holmes said thoughtfully, "are among the most powerful forces in human life." I nodded. "They shape our days." "They shape our thoughts as well," Holmes replied. We turned onto a slightly broader road, where the glow of shop windows illuminated the pavement. Holmes continued speaking in the same calm tone. "When a habit is repeated often enough," he said, "it becomes almost automatic. Yes, the body remembers what the mind forgets." I considered this idea as we walked. "Do you suppose Finch will continue his nightly gardening?" Holmes gave a quiet chuckle. "For a time, perhaps." And eventually, Holmes looked upward briefly at the quiet sky above the rooftops. "Eventually, the habit will change." "How so?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Once a person becomes aware of a routine," he said, "it no longer needs to continue unconsciously." "That makes sense." We walked another block before Holmes spoke again. "You know, Watson," he said, "there is something rather comforting about this particular case." I glanced at him. "Yes." Holmes gestured lightly behind us, toward the direction of Mr. Finch's house, a garden that continues to care for itself. I laughed softly. "When you put it that way, it sounds almost magical." Holmes shook his head. "No magic required, only habit." "Exactly." The evening air had grown cooler now, and a light breeze moved through the quiet street. Holmes slowed his pace slightly. "There are far worse things in the world," he said, "than discovering that one's own routines are dependable." "Yes," I agreed. "Dependable routines create peace." Holmes nodded. "And peace," he added, "something many people overlook." We turned the corner leading back toward the busier parts of London. The distant glow of Baker Street was beginning to appear ahead of us. Holmes glanced once more toward the quiet Bloomsbury neighborhood behind us. "I believe," he said calmly, "that Miss Finch will sleep very well tonight, And tomorrow morning? Holmes smiled. Tomorrow morning he will step into his garden and find it exactly as he left it. I nodded. That would be the most satisfying outcome. Holmes gave a quiet chuckle. My dear Watson, he said, in this case, the most satisfying outcome is also the most peaceful one. Our footsteps continued along the quiet pavement as the lights of Baker Street drew nearer. Behind us, Bloomsbury rested quietly beneath the evening sky, and somewhere among its narrow terraces, a small garden waited patiently for another calm night to pass. The following morning arrived with a quiet clarity that often visits London after a calm night. Sunlight filtered softly through the curtains of our sitting room at Baker Street, illuminating the familiar arrangement of chairs, books, and the steady clock upon the mantel. Sherlock Holmes was already awake. I found him seated by the window with a cup of tea, observing the street below with the calm attentiveness that seemed to accompany his mornings. You slept well, Watson, he said, without turning. Very well, I replied. Holmes nodded. Peaceful cases often have that effect. I joined him at the table, where Miss Hudson had left the breakfast tray. For a few moments we ate in companionable silence, while Baker Street slowly came to life outside. A delivery cart rolled past the window. A shopkeeper opened his door across the street. The city was beginning another day, just as it had done countless times before. Holmes set down his cup. I suspect, he said thoughtfully, that Miss Finch has already visited his garden this morning. You believe the routine continued? Holmes smiled faintly. Habits rarely vanish overnight. Before I could reply, footsteps sounded upon the stairs. A moment later, Mrs. Hudson appeared at the door. There is a gentleman here to see you, Mr. Holmes, she said. Holmes raised an eyebrow slightly. Mr. Finch, perhaps. Yes, sir, she replied. Holmes stood. Please show him up. Mr. Finch entered the room a few moments later, his expression brighter than when we had first met him. Good morning, Mr. Holmes. Dr. Watson. Holmes gestured warmly toward the chair by the fire. Good morning, Mr. Finch. You appear well. I feel well, he replied. Holmes studied him with quiet interest. And your garden? Mr. Finch smiled. It was exactly as I left it. Holmes nodded with satisfaction. I thought it might be. Mr. Finch leaned back comfortably in his chair. I followed your suggestion yesterday evening, he said. You completed your usual routine? Yes. And afterward? Mr. Finch chuckled softly. I went to bed with the very clear thought that if the garden changed again, it would not trouble me. Holmes smiled. And this morning, Finch folded his hands together. This morning, everything was precisely the same as the night before. Holmes glanced briefly toward me. Awareness, she said quietly, is often the only adjustment required. Mr. Finch nodded thoughtfully. I believe you were right about habit. Holmes leaned back in his chair. Habits are loyal companions, he said, but once we notice them, they become easier to guide. Mr. Finch laughed softly. I must admit, Mr. Holmes, I almost feel disappointed that the mystery has ended. Holmes chuckled. Many mysteries end more quietly than they begin. Mr. Finch looked around the familiar sitting room of Baker Street. I will certainly remember this one. Holmes inclined his head politely. And your garden will continue to provide you with peaceful evenings. I hope so, Mr. Finch said. He stood and reached for his hat. I simply wished to thank you for your help. Holmes waved a hand gently. It was a most agreeable matter to consider. Mr. Finch moved toward the door, then paused. You know, he said thoughtfully, I believe I shall enjoy tending the garden even more now. Holmes smiled. That is the best possible outcome. Mr. Finch nodded and departed with a light step. The door closed softly behind him. For a moment Holmes and I sat quietly once more beside the fire. Well, Watson? Holmes said at last. Yes? Holmes glanced toward the morning sunlight filling the room. A most peaceful conclusion. I nodded. Yes, indeed. Holmes reached for his violin resting beside the chair. There is something satisfying, he said, about a mystery that ends with a garden in good order. I smiled. And a gentleman sleeping soundly. Holmes placed the violin beneath his chin and began to play softly. Outside, Baker Street continued its gentle rhythm, and somewhere in Bloomsbury, a small garden rested quietly in the morning light, exactly as it should. The remainder of the morning passed quietly at Baker Street. Sunlight had grown brighter now, though the gentle calm of the earlier hours still lingered in the sitting room. The fire had burned lower, leaving only a soft warmth in the grate, while the clock upon the mantel continued its steady and reassuring rhythm. Sherlock Holmes's violin rested across his shoulder. The melody he played was slow and thoughtful, never rising sharply, never demanding attention. It filled the room in the same way a breeze fills an open window, naturally and without effort. I sat nearby with my medical journal once again, though I confess I had not turned a page for some time. Music, when Holmes chose to play softly, had a way of slowing one's thoughts. After several minutes, the final notes faded gently to silence. Holmes lowered the violin. A quiet resolution, he said. Yes, I replied. Holmes placed the instrument carefully beside his chair. Many cases conclude with excitement, he continued. Some end with surprise, and others, I said, with relief. Holmes smiled faintly. But the best ones, he added, end with understanding. The room fell silent again. Outside, Baker Street had fully awakened. The sounds of carts and conversation drifted faintly through the window, though they seemed distant from the calm of our sitting room. I glanced toward Holmes. You seem particularly satisfied with this case. Holmes leaned back comfortably. There is something pleasing about a mystery that resolves itself through observation, rather than confrontation. I nodded. No villains to pursue, no danger to avoid. Holmes folded his hands together. Only a garden, he said, and a routine. Yes. The clock ticked quietly. You know, Watson, Holmes continued, most people underestimate the power of routine. How so? Holmes gestured lightly around the room. Routine creates stability. Yes, but it also creates patterns, Holmes said. Patterns that the mind continues even when we are not aware of them. I considered Mr. Finch's careful habits, and once we recognize those patterns, Holmes smiled, they become easier to understand. A gentle breeze moved the curtains near the window. The morning light shifted slightly across the floorboards, illuminating the quiet room in a soft golden tone. It is rather pleasant, I said after a moment, to think of Finch tending his garden this evening. Holmes nodded. Yes, and perhaps this time he will remember doing it. Holmes chuckled quietly. I suspect he will. The fire gave a final soft crackle. Holmes reached for the poker and adjusted one of the remaining coals. You know, he said thoughtfully, there are few places more peaceful than a small garden cared for by patient hands. I smiled. You almost sound sentimental. Holmes raised an eyebrow. Observation is not sentiment, Watson. No, Holmes returned the poker to its stand. It is simply the recognition of what works. The room fell silent again. Holmes closed his eyes briefly, as though enjoying the quiet. The clock ticked. Outside, London continued its steady rhythm. And in that moment, Baker Street itself seemed perfectly content, just as Mr. Finch's small Bloomsbury garden must now have been. After a while, Holmes opened his eyes again. Well, he said calmly. Yes? Holmes reached for his violin once more. I believe the day has settled nicely. He began to play again, the soft notes drifting easily through the warm room, and as the music continued, I found myself thinking that some mysteries, like quiet gardens, required nothing more than patience to understand. Sometimes the most satisfying answers were the simplest ones, and sometimes the most peaceful cases were the ones that ended exactly where they began, with calm, routine, and the gentle comfort of things continuing as they always had. Evening returned to London with the same quiet patience it always had. At Baker Street, the lamps had been lit early. A warm glow filled the sitting room with a calm, steady light that softened the edges of the furniture and gave the familiar space welcoming warmth. The fire burned gently in the grate. Sherlock Holmes sat in his armchair beside it, long legs stretched comfortably before him, while the violin rested loosely across his lap. Outside, Baker Street had settled into its evening rhythm. Carriages passed now and then, their wheels producing the soft rolling sound that had become part of the city's nightly music. Footsteps occasionally echoed along the pavement, followed by the quiet murmur of distant conversation. Watson, myself, sat in the chair opposite Holmes, enjoying the warmth of the fire and the rare luxury of a completely uneventful evening. Holmes appeared equally content. "You know, Watson," he said after some time, "cases such as Mr. Finch's are not often recorded." I smiled. "That is probably because very little actually happened." Holmes chuckled softly. "On the surface, yes." The fire crackled gently, "but the lesson itself," Holmes continued, "is rather valuable." I raised an eyebrow. "And what lesson is that?" Holmes lifted the violin slightly, turning it thoughtfully in his hands. "That the most puzzling mysteries sometimes arise from the most ordinary habits." I nodded. Yes, I suppose that is true." Holmes glanced toward the window, where the evening sky had grown darker. "Mr. Finch's garden," he said, "was never truly mysterious." "No?" Holmes shook his head. "It was simply continuing its routine." "And Mr. Finch himself was the one maintaining it," I added. "Exactly." Holmes leaned back in his chair. "The mind is an extraordinary thing, Watson." "In what sense?" Holmes rested his fingers lightly upon the violin strings. "It seeks order," he said. "And when it finds a routine that brings comfort, it repeats it faithfully." I thought for a moment of the neat gravel path, the trimmed roses, and the quiet bench at the far end of the garden. "There is something rather pleasant about that," I said. Holmes nodded. Yes. The clock upon the mantel chimed softly, marking the hour. Holmes listened to it with quiet appreciation. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "the world would likely be a calmer place if more people valued simple routines. Gardens, for instance." Holmes smiled faintly. Yes, the fire burned steadily. Holmes lifted the violin and placed it beneath his chin. The melody he began to play was soft and unhurried. It filled the sitting room in the same gentle way that twilight fills a quiet street. The notes rose slowly and then drifted downward again, like leaves settling back to the earth. I closed my eyes for a moment, listening. Outside, London continued its endless rhythm, though from the comfort of Baker Street it felt distant and peaceful. Holmes's music continued softly, and somewhere across the city, in the calm neighborhood of Bloomsbury, Mr. Finch was very likely stepping into his garden once more. The gravel path would crunch quietly beneath his shoes. The roses would stand neatly along their trellises. Perhaps he would sweep a leaf or adjust a branch before sitting on the bench for a moment of quiet reflection. Nothing unusual, nothing mysterious. Simply the continuation of a familiar and comforting routine. Holmes lowered the violin slowly as the final note faded. The room returned to its gentle silence. "Well, Watson," he said. "Yes." Holmes gave a small, satisfied smile. "I believe the garden is at peace." I nodded. "And Baker Street as well." Holmes leaned back in his chair, the firelight reflecting softly in his eyes. Outside, the lamps of London glowed steadily in the night. Inside, the sitting room remained warm and quiet, and like Mr. Finch's small garden in Bloomsbury, everything rested exactly as it should.